There is a moment in the reign of Paul Atreides, somewhere between the 12th and 13th year of his rule, when 61 billion human beings have already died in his name, and the killing is not yet finished. He sits on the lion throne in the Arrakeen Citadel, and his prescient eyes can see centuries unfolding like the pages of a book he never wanted to read. He knows the shape of every threat approaching from beyond the stars. He can taste betrayal before the traitor has even decided to act. And yet, the conspiracy that will undo him does not come from beyond the stars. It comes from the woman who sleeps in the room next to his, and from a creature wearing a dead man's face. This is the story of how a god was brought to his knees, not by an army, not by a rival empire, but by grief, by loneliness, and by the oldest weapon in the political arsenal of the known universe. A promise too sweet to refuse. To understand why the conspiracy works, you have to understand what the Imperium looks like after 12 years of holy war. The Jihad that Paul unleashed when he seized the throne has reshaped the galaxy in ways that even he did not fully anticipate. Worlds that resisted Muad'Dib's Fremen legions were burned to bare rock. Populations that clung to the old Corrino ways were scattered across refugee ships that had nowhere to land. The Spacing Guild, the Bene Gesserit, the Landsraad houses that once held the balance of power in a careful, centuries-old equilibrium, all of them have been diminished, humiliated, forced into the shadow of a single throne on a single desert planet. But here's the thing about empires built on religious fervor. The moment the war ends, the fervor begins to curdle. Paul's Fremen, once the most disciplined and terrifying fighting force in human history, are becoming bureaucrats and merchants and landlords on the very worlds they conquered. The purity of the Sietch is being replaced by the corruption of the city. The Kizarate, the religious arm of his government, a priesthood that Paul never truly wanted, is consolidating its own power in ways that have nothing to do with the emperor's wishes and everything to do with institutional self-preservation. Korba the Panegyrist, once a Fedaykin death commando who would have died for Muad'Dib without a moment's hesitation, now spends his days accumulating political influence and polishing the mythology of the throne into something that serves his ambitions more than it serves the truth. And Paul himself is drowning. Not in enemies, but in the weight of what he has become. The prescience that once felt like a gift, the ability to see the branching paths of the future and choose among them, now feels like a cage made of glass. He can see every possible future, and in almost every single one of them, something terrible is waiting. He has seen the Jihad. He has seen the death toll. He has seen what his name will come to mean across 10,000 worlds, and the knowledge sits in his chest like a stone. He is a man trapped in the amber of his own godhood, visible to everyone, touchable by no one, and the cracks are showing to anyone patient enough to look. This is the vacuum that the Bene Tleilaxu have been waiting for. Not a vacuum of military power, because Paul's legions are still vast. Not a vacuum of political authority, because the emperor's word is still law from one edge of the Imperium to the other. The vacuum is personal. It is emotional. It is the hollow space inside a man who has everything the universe can offer, except the one thing he actually wants, which is a life he did not have to see coming before he lived it. The Tleilaxu are, by almost any measure, the most reviled civilization in the known universe. They are genetic sorcerers, flesh merchants, creators of twisted biological products that the rest of humanity views with a volatile mixture of dependence and disgust. Their society is sealed off from outsiders, governed by a theocratic structure that even the Bene Gesserit find opaque. Their women are never seen, their cities are closed. Their motivations are understood by almost no one beyond their own masters. But their technology is indispensable. Their axolotl tanks produce Gholas, biological reconstructions of the dead, grown from cells harvested before or after death and shaped into living, breathing replicas of people who no longer exist. They produce twisted mentats, face dancers capable of mimicking any human being down to the cellular level, and a pharmacopoeia of substances that no other faction can replicate. The technology is extraordinary. The ethics are, to put it generously, a matter of some debate. But the Tleilaxu are not simply merchants of the grotesque. They are strategists of a particular and patient kind. They think in generations, in centuries, in slow biological arcs that most other factions cannot even perceive. And in the aftermath of the Jihad, they have identified Paul Atreides not as an invincible god emperor, but as a man with a very specific and exploitable weakness. He misses his teacher, he misses his friend, he misses Duncan, Idaho. Duncan, Idaho died on Arrakis during the Harkonnen assault on the Atreides stronghold in Arrakeen. He died buying time for Paul and Lady Jessica to escape into the deep desert, holding a corridor against Sardaukar soldiers, the Emperor's own elite troops, with nothing but a blade and the kind of stubborn, incandescent loyalty that makes legends out of otherwise mortal men. He killed 19 Sardaukar before they brought him down. 19 of the finest soldiers in the Imperium, and one swordmaster of Janaz held them all. His death was one of the defining losses of Paul's youth, a wound that never fully closed because it never had the chance to. Paul went into the desert, a boy who had just lost everything. He emerged as Muad'Dib, and in the transformation, there was never time to grieve. The Tleilaxu know this. They have Duncan's cells, harvested from the battlefield, preserved across the years with the meticulous care of people who understand that dead flesh is simply raw material waiting for the right application. They have been growing something in their tanks. And when the time is right, they offer Paul a gift. A Ghola of Duncan, Idaho, rebuilt from the original genetic material, given the name Hayt, trained as a Mentat philosopher and a Zensuni adept, and presented to the Emperor of the known universe as a gesture of goodwill from a faction that has never in its history performed a gesture of goodwill without expecting compound interest. It is, of course, nothing of the sort. Hayt is a weapon, but he is a weapon of extraordinary subtlety because he is not designed to simply kill Paul. Any assassin could attempt that, and Paul's prescience would see the blade coming long before it was drawn. The Tleilaxu have buried a compulsion deep within Hayt's conditioning, a trigger that will activate at the moment of Paul's greatest emotional vulnerability and compel the Ghola to strike. But even this is secondary to Hayt's true purpose. He is designed to make Paul feel, to remind him of what he has lost, to crack open the emotional armor that 12 years of prescient godhood have built around the Emperor's heart and let something raw and vulnerable bleed through. Every time Paul looks at Hayt, he sees Duncan's face. He hears echoes of Duncan's voice. He is confronted with the ghost of a friendship that defined who he was before the universe decided to make him something else entirely. The Tleilaxu are not aiming for Paul's body. They are aiming for his humanity. And their aim is devastatingly precise. Now, to understand the second pillar of this conspiracy, we need to turn our attention to the most dangerous room in the Arrakeen Palace. Not the throne room with its ancient Carino banners replaced by Atreides hawks. Not the war chamber, where Stilgar still keeps his crysknife sharp and his counsel blunt. The most dangerous room in the palace belongs to Princess Irulan. Irulan Carino is, on paper, the Empress of the known universe. She is Paul's wife by political arrangement, the eldest daughter of Shaddam IV, the last Carino emperor, and her marriage to Paul was the legal mechanism by which he claimed the imperial throne without provoking a war against every remaining noble house in the Landsraad. The marriage was a masterstroke of political engineering. It was also completely hollow. Paul has never touched her. He has never shared her bed. He has never given her a child. His love, his loyalty, his passion, his heirs, all of it belongs to Chani, the daughter of Liet Kynes, the Fremen woman who stood beside him in the desert long before he wore a crown or commanded anything more than a stolen stillsuit. Irulan is empress in title and absolutely nothing else, and she knows it with a bitterness that has had 12 long years to ferment into something truly corrosive. It would be easy and reductive to frame Irulan's resentment as simple jealousy, but that would be to misunderstand everything about who she is and what she was built to be. Irulan is Bene Gesserit trained, one of the finest products of their educational system. She is a scholar of genuine brilliance, a historian, an author of multiple volumes on Muad'Dib and the Atreides' rise to power, including the collected sayings of Muad'Dib and her own private reflections on the ascendancy of the Atreides house. Her mind is sharp enough to dissect empires on the page. Her frustration is not simply that Paul does not love her. It is that she has been made irrelevant in the most comprehensive way possible. She was raised to be a political force, bred by the Bene Gesserit across generations to continue a genetic program that stretches back thousands of years. A program aimed at producing the Kwisatz Haderach, the super being who would bridge space and time. Paul is that super being arrived one generation too early and entirely outside the sisterhood's control. And he has severed Irulan from her purpose entirely. He has taken her name, her title, her lineage, and her future, and given her nothing in return except a room in his palace and the privilege of chronicling his glory while being excluded from shaping it. That is not jealousy. That is existential erasure. And a woman trained by the Bene Gesserit, a woman who was taught to see power as a living thing that must be seized or else it seizes you, does not simply accept erasure. What Irulan does is quiet, methodical, and devastating. She begins administering contraceptives to Chani, secretly, consistently, hidden in Chani's food or drink, with the kind of pharmaceutical precision that only Bene Gesserit training could provide. Paul wants an heir by Chani, a true Atreides child born of love rather than political calculation. And Irulan is making certain that heir never arrives. Every month that passes without a pregnancy is a small private victory for Irulan, a silent act of sabotage that strikes at the very thing Paul cares about most in the universe. She is not killing anyone. She is not raising armies or recruiting assassins. She is simply ensuring that the Atreides genetic line dead ends with Paul. And she's doing it with the patience and discipline of a woman who was taught to think not in years, but in centuries. But Irulan is not acting alone. This is where the conspiracy deepens into something far more elaborate and more dangerous than a bitter wife and a Tleilaxu gift horse. Irulan is connected to the Bene Gesserit, who have their own urgent reasons for wanting Paul's genetic line brought back under their control. The sisterhood did not spend 10,000 years engineering bloodlines to watch their greatest achievement operate outside their influence. She is in communication with elements of the Spacing Guild, who resent Paul's monopoly on the spice melange, and, even more dangerously, his prescient ability to see through the navigational monopoly that has been the source of guild power since the days of the Butlerian Jihad. And she is, whether she fully grasps the architecture of it or not, serving the interests of the Tleilaxu plot that delivered Hayt to the palace steps. These three factions, the Bene Tleilax, the Bene Gesserit, and the Spacing Guild, form the conspiracy that Frank Herbert calls the conspiracy of the three. They're the most powerful institutions in the Imperium apart from the throne itself, and Irulan is their instrument inside the walls. The architecture of this sabotage is worth pausing over, because it reveals something profound about how Frank Herbert understood the mechanics of power and its destruction. The conspirators do not try to match Paul's strength. They do not build a bigger army, or develop a superior weapon, or find a rival prescient to counter his visions. Instead, they identify the structural weaknesses in Paul's position and apply pressure to each one simultaneously, the way a geologist finds the fault lines in a cliff face and places charges at precisely the right points. The first weakness is emotional. Paul is exhausted by prescience, haunted by the futures he cannot prevent, and deeply, corrosively lonely in a way that no amount of political power can remedy. The Ghola exploits this by reawakening feelings of loss and connection that Paul has tried to bury beneath the obligations of empire. The second weakness is biological. Paul's empire depends on the continuation of the Atreides bloodline, and without a legitimate heir, the entire political structure becomes dangerously fragile. Irulan's contraceptive sabotage attacks this foundation directly, ensuring that the dynasty has no future even as it dominates the present. The third weakness is theological. Paul has become Muad'Dib, a messianic figure worshipped by billions, and that role has trapped him inside a prison of expectation and obligation that limits his ability to act as a free agent. A god cannot show weakness. A god cannot admit doubt. A god cannot simply walk away from his worshippers and say he has had enough. And so the conspirators construct a trap that forces Paul to choose between his divine image and his human heart, knowing that either choice will damage him beyond recovery. The Spacing Guild contributes to this architecture by providing logistical cover for the conspiracy, and by deploying a weapon that represents perhaps the most terrifying escalation in the entire plot: the stone burner. A stone burner is a device of almost obscene destructive power, a weapon that generates a form of subatomic fusion capable of burning through the ground itself, killing everything within its blast radius, and depending on its calibration, releasing a specific wavelength of radiation known as J-rays that destroys the eyes. The effect is not merely blindness. It is a targeted, almost surgical destruction of the optic nerve, a refinement of cruelty that suggests the weapon was designed not just to kill, but to diminish. The Guild's agents deploy a stone burner in the streets of Arrakeen. When it detonates, Paul is caught in its radiation. And the Emperor of the known universe, the man whose prescient vision could pierce the veil of time itself, loses his physical sight. His eyes are burned away. Now, Paul's prescience allows him to continue functioning as though he can see. He walks the halls of his palace with perfect confidence, navigating by the map of the future in his mind rather than by the light entering his ruined eyes. To those around him, it appears to be a miracle, further proof of his divine nature, a God who does not need mortal eyes to see. But Paul knows the truth. He is running on borrowed time. Prescient vision is not true sight. It is a prediction, a model of what should be happening at any given moment. And the instant reality deviates from that model in a way he has not foreseen. He will stumble, he will reach for something that is not there, and the illusion will shatter. The stone burner has not killed him, but it has placed a ticking clock on his power, and every heartbeat brings him closer to the moment when the mask falls. Oh, and it is in this weakened, diminished state that the final act of the conspiracy unfolds with the precision of a trap that has been set across years. Chani, after the long period of Irulan's secret interference, finally conceives. Perhaps the contraceptives were discovered and stopped. Perhaps Chani's Fremen biology eventually overcame them. But the years of chemical sabotage have taken their toll on her body in ways that even Fremen resilience and the deep desert's harsh conditioning cannot overcome. The pregnancy is dangerous from the beginning. When the time comes, Chani gives birth to twins, a boy and a girl, Leto and Ganima. But the effort of bringing them into the world destroys her. She dies in childbirth, bleeding out on the floor of the Arrakeen Citadel. And with her death, something fundamental in Paul Atreides dies as well. The last tether connecting the god to the man is severed. This is the moment Scytale has been waiting for. This is the fulcrum on which the entire conspiracy turns. The Tleilaxu face dancer reveals himself, dropping whatever mask of servitude or diplomacy he has been wearing, and offers Paul a bargain that is diabolical in its precision. The Tleilaxu can bring Chani back. They have the technology. They have the axolotl tanks. They can grow a Ghola of Chani from preserved cellular material, a perfect biological replica, and return her to Paul's arms as though death itself were merely an inconvenience. All they ask in return is something simple. They want control of the Atreides genetic material. They want Paul's cells, his bloodline, his prescient DNA handed over to the tanks of the Bene Tleilax so they can replicate what he is. They want to reproduce God. Consider the cruelty of this offer. Consider the precision of its timing. Paul is standing over the body of the only woman he ever truly loved. His children are newborns, still wet with their mother's blood. His eyes are gone. His empire is fracturing along lines he can see, but no longer has the strength to hold together. And a creature from the most despised civilization in the galaxy is telling him that he can have it all back, that death itself can be reversed, that the wound can be unmade, if only he surrenders the one thing that makes him more than human. It is a trap baited with the most powerful lure in the universe. Not power, not spice, not territory, love. The Tleilaxu have weaponized grief itself, refined it into a transaction, and presented it to a broken man at the exact moment when his defenses are at their lowest. And Paul, for all his prescience, for all his centuries of foresight laid out like a roadmap in his mind, is tempted. This is the moment that reveals the true genius of Herbert's writing and the true horror of the conspiracy. The offer almost works. Not because Paul is weak, but because he is human. Beneath the title, beneath the religion, beneath the golden throne, and the billions of worshippers who would die screaming his name, he is a man who lost the woman he loved and wants her back. That is not weakness. That is the most universal and recognizable human experience imaginable. And the conspirators have built their entire elaborate multi-faction years-long plan around exactly that vulnerability. But Paul refuses. He refuses not because the offer is unappealing, but because he understands what accepting it would truly mean. A Ghola of Chani would not be Chani. It would be a copy, a biological echo, shaped by Tleilaxu hands and serving Tleilaxu purposes, a leash disguised as a gift. To accept would be to surrender his autonomy, his genetic legacy, and ultimately his children's future to the one faction in the galaxy least deserving of that trust. The price of getting Chani back would be losing everything Chani lived for. And so Paul, blind, grieving, broken in ways that will never fully heal, says no. Saitail, recognizing that his gambit has failed and his life is now measured in seconds, makes one final, desperate move. He threatens the infant twins, holding a weapon over the newborns, hoping to force Paul's hand through terror rather than temptation. But this is where the Tleilaxu's own weapon turns against them. Duncan, Idaho, the Ghola Hayt, the instrument that was supposed to be Paul's undoing, the carefully conditioned assassin designed to strike at the moment of maximum vulnerability, breaks free of his programming. The buried memories of the original Duncan surface like a drowning man fighting his way to air, cracking through the layers of Tleilaxu conditioning, and Hayt kills Saitail to protect the children of the man he once served. The weapon misfires, the trap closes on the trapper, and in doing so, it provides Herbert with one of his most profound statements about human identity. That even a manufactured copy of a loyal man carries, somewhere in its cells, the echo of that loyalty. But the conspiracy has still achieved its essential purpose, even in its apparent failure. Paul is broken. Chani is dead. His physical sight is gone. And when his prescient vision finally fails him, when reality shifts in a way his future sight did not predict, when the world around him deviates from the template in his mind, and he reaches for a wall that is not where it should be, he does what ancient Fremen law demands of the blind. He walks into the desert. He does not abdicate with a proclamation or a ceremony or a speech from the balcony of the citadel. He simply walks out through the shield wall and into the open sand, and the desert swallows him the way it swallows everything on Arrakis, quietly, completely. The throne passes to Alia, his sister, whose own inner demons, the voice of the Baron Harkonnen living inside her genetic memory, will eventually consume her in a tragedy that rivals Paul's own. And the twins, Leto and Ganima, will inherit a universe shaped entirely by the consequences of this conspiracy. Leto II will eventually claim the throne and embark on what he calls the Golden Path, a 4,000-year campaign of enforced stagnation designed to inoculate humanity against extinction, a plan so radical and so brutal in its execution that it makes Paul's Jihad look like a minor territorial dispute. The Golden Path exists precisely because Paul could not walk it. He saw it in his visions. He understood its necessity, but he could not bring himself to pay the price it demanded, which was the complete and irrevocable sacrifice of his own humanity. The conspiracy of the three did not create the need for the Golden Path. But by targeting Paul's grief, by exploiting his love, by turning his most human qualities into weapons against him, the conspirators guaranteed that the burden would fall to the next generation, to a boy who would transform himself into something no longer recognizable as human in order to save a species that would never understand what he had done for them. And then there's Irulan. What becomes of the woman who secretly poisoned her husband's beloved and helped dismantle an empire from the inside? Something that Herbert himself seemed to find deeply worth exploring because he does not discard her. Irulan survives. She is not executed for treason. She is not exiled to some forgotten world. She is not punished in any dramatic fashion that would satisfy a simple revenge narrative. Instead, she becomes the caretaker and protector of the very children she tried to prevent from existing. She raises Leto and Ganima in the years following Paul's disappearance. She defends them against threats both political and physical. She writes the histories that will define how the universe remembers Paul Muad'Dib for millennia to come. There is a bitter and complicated poetry in this. Irulan's scholarly resentment, the fury of a brilliant woman reduced to a decorative title while a Fremen concubine held the heart of the most powerful man alive, transforms into something else entirely after Paul's fall. She becomes arguably the most important Atreides historian, the one whose carefully chosen words shape how billions of human beings across thousands of years understand the emperor they worshipped. Her betrayal gave her nothing she wanted: no throne, no children of her own blood, no restoration of the Carino dynasty she was born to serve. But her survival gave her something Paul never allowed her to have during his reign: a purpose that was genuinely hers. Whether that constitutes redemption or simply a different species of tragedy is a question Herbert leaves deliberately and maddeningly unanswered. What stays with me most about this conspiracy is not the mechanics of the plot, clever as they are, but what the whole affair reveals about the nature of power itself. Paul Atreides had prescience. He could see the future in branching pathways of light and shadow. He commanded the most feared military force in the known galaxy. He was worshipped as a living god by billions of devoted followers who had killed and died in his name across 61 billion graves. And none of it, not one fragment of it, could protect him from the oldest and simplest vulnerabilities of the human condition: grief, loneliness, the desire to be loved, not as a symbol, but as a man. The Tleilaxu understood this. The Bene Gesserit understood this. The Spacing Guild, in their own mercantile and calculating way, understood this. Even Irulan, wounded and furious and brilliant in her cage, understood this. You do not destroy a god by challenging his divinity. You destroy him by reminding him that he is mortal. You do not tear down an empire with warships and atomic weapons. You tear it down by finding the one person the emperor cannot bear to lose, and then you take her away. Frank Herbert wrote Dune Messiah as a deliberate and systematic deconstruction of the hero myth that the first novel appeared to celebrate, and the conspiracy of the three is the surgical instrument of that deconstruction. It is not a story about a clever assassination plot that almost worked. It is a story about the fundamental incompatibility between human emotion and absolute power. Paul cannot be both a god and a grieving husband. He cannot be both a prescient emperor and a man who misses his dead friend. The conspiracy does not create these contradictions. It simply exposes them, peels back the golden armor plate by plate, and reveals the fragile, bleeding, irreducibly human thing underneath. Whew. The desert swallows Paul Atreides the way it swallows everything on Arrakis.